Imagine a place so controlled that even a whisper feels illegal. A system built not for reform, but for silence. From Colorado's ADX Florence to California's Pelican Bay, America created a network of human isolation chambers, each designed to break the mind before the body. This is the untold story of how the U.S. built its Supermax empire, and what it costs to keep a nation safe. Before we begin, hit subscribe and like this video, because what you're about to hear has been hidden behind concrete and steel for decades. In the late 1980s, America was in the grip of fear. The crack epidemic had exploded, homicide rates were at historic highs, and prisons were boiling over with violence. Wardens and politicians alike warned that the system was losing control. Prison gangs, like the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, and Black Guerrilla Family, had transformed penitentiaries into battlegrounds. Guards were attacked, inmates murdered, riots erupted. Something drastic had to be done. That's when the idea of total control was born. In 1983, at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, two correctional officers, Merle Klutz and Robert Hoffman, were murdered by inmates associated with the Aryan Brotherhood, including a man named Thomas Silverstein, whose name would later become synonymous with isolation itself. After these killings, Marion went into what was called a permanent lockdown. Inmates were confined to their cells for 23 hours a day, no yard time, no contact, no movement without chains. The experiment was meant to be temporary. Instead, it became the blueprint for the future. Federal officials took notice. Marion's lockdown regime drastically reduced violence, but at a staggering human cost. Prisoners began to deteriorate mentally, some talking to walls, others smearing blood or feces in desperate acts of rebellion. Psychiatrists warned that prolonged isolation would lead to irreversible psychological damage. But Washington saw something else, a model that worked. By 1994, the United States Bureau of Prisons broke ground on a new kind of facility in the high desert of Colorado, a prison designed from the ground up for complete sensory deprivation. Its name, the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence. From the outside, ADX looked like an ordinary compound, low-profile building surrounded by fences and guard towers. But inside it was a fortress of psychological warfare. Cells made of poured concrete, beds molded into the wall, windows so narrow you could only see the sky. Everything, from the lighting to the airflow, was engineered to strip away control from the inmate and place it firmly in the hands of the institution. Officials called it the clean version of hell. ADX was not meant for the average prisoner. It was for what the Bureau called the worst of the worst: cartel bosses, terrorists, gang leaders, and men who had murdered behind bars. Over time, it would house infamous figures: the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, the Boston Marathon bomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, and cartel kingpin El Chapo Guzman. Each man lived in a box, alone, watched, silenced. But while ADX became the symbol of federal control, states began to follow suit. In California, Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989, on the foggy northern edge of the state near the Oregon border. Its Security Housing Unit, SHU, mirrored ADX's architecture: gray walls, electronic doors, and concrete yards called dog runs. Pelican Bay quickly filled with gang leaders from the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, and Aryan Brotherhood. Prison officials believed isolating them would collapse the gang hierarchy, but it didn't. Instead, inmates created ghost networks, communication systems through coded letters, artwork, and even the pipes in their cells. The control experiment wasn't ending violence, it was evolving it. Meanwhile, on the opposite coast, Red Onion State Prison opened in Virginia in 1998 as part of a growing movement to get tough on crime. It was built in an economically struggling Appalachian town, where prison jobs were sold as a form of economic salvation. But Red Onion's purpose was clear: to break the spirit of the worst inmates. Within a year of opening, allegations of beatings, racial discrimination, and abuse flooded watchdog organizations. Inmates reported being shackled for hours, denied mental health care, and punished for minor infractions. And then came USP Thomson in Illinois, built in 2001 but left empty for nearly a decade. Originally a state facility, it was later purchased by the federal government and designated as another high-security prison with a special management unit. Many of its cells were modeled after ADX, tight, soundproof, and sealed. By the early 2000s, America had quietly created a nationwide web of Supermaxes, each operating under the same doctrine: control through isolation. The numbers grew rapidly. A 2010 report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics revealed that more than 80,000 people were being held in solitary confinement across the country. The ACLU called it a crisis of conscience, warning that America had turned incarceration into psychological warfare. Inside these cells, silence wasn't peace, it was punishment. Days blurred together. Lights never dimmed. Some inmates began hallucinating, hearing voices, seeing shadows that weren't there. One man at Pelican Bay wrote that he hadn't touched another human being in over a decade. Yet even as stories of madness and despair leaked out, public support for these prisons remained strong. Politicians called them necessary for safety. "You can't reason with evil," one warden famously said. "You contain it." But what happens when containment becomes the crime? In the years to come, lawsuits, hunger strikes, and investigations would expose the human toll of America's isolation empire. The system built to control chaos was now accused of creating it. And behind every wall, from Florence to Crescent City, from Pound, Virginia to Thomson, Illinois, echoed the same question. How far can a nation go to keep control before it loses its humanity? Every Supermax prison has its own rhythm, a slow, mechanical heartbeat that never changes. Doors open with a heavy electric buzz, food slots clang shut, and the intercom hums with static. But the rhythm inside a solitary cell? That's the sound of time dying. At ADX Florence, inmates spend 23 hours a day locked inside concrete rooms measuring 7 by 12 feet. The bed, desk, and stool are part of the cell, molded from solid concrete. The window, just 4 inches wide and 3 feet long, is angled upward so prisoners can't see the horizon, only a sliver of sky. The walls are soundproof. Even when a man screams, the noise dies before it reaches the next cell. The Bureau of Prisons calls this controlled housing. Inmates call it living burial. Each morning begins the same. A slot opens and a tray slides through. Oatmeal, a slice of bread, maybe a boiled egg. Guards rarely speak, only orders. Back against the wall. Hands visible. Movement means punishment. Anger means more isolation. Thomas Silverstein, the man whose actions helped inspire the Supermax model, spent over 35 years in solitary confinement, one of the longest periods in U.S. history. In a rare letter he wrote, "I live in a tomb. My eyes hurt from staring at gray walls. I haven't touched another human being in decades." His words describe what psychologists later called SHU syndrome, a cluster of symptoms seen in long-term isolation: hypersensitivity to noise, hallucinations, panic attacks, paranoia, and memory loss. For some, the silence becomes unbearable. For others, it becomes their only companion. At Pelican Bay State Prison, California's notorious security housing unit, SHU, once held more than 1,000 men in total isolation. The cells there were nearly identical to ADX, down to the polished concrete floors and metal food slots. But inmates at Pelican Bay found ways to resist. They developed an entire communication system using the fishing line, a long thread made from torn bedsheets, toothpaste caps, and smuggled notes. By sliding it under the cell door, they could pass messages down the tier. Others tapped on the plumbing, using the echo of pipes to send coded knocks between cells. Some even exchanged artwork and poetry, folded so small they could fit through ventilation holes. One former inmate, Todd Ashker, spent over 2 decades in Pelican Bay's SHU. He described the mental toll vividly. You start talking to ants, to the cracks on the wall. You remember faces you haven't seen in 20 years and you argue with them. You forget the sound of laughter. Ashker would later become one of the lead plaintiffs in Ashker versus Governor of California, a lawsuit that challenged indefinite solitary confinement. His fight, alongside hundreds of others, exposed a truth the state could no longer ignore. Isolation wasn't reforming inmates, it was destroying them. Across the country, similar stories emerged. At Red Onion State Prison in Virginia, inmates filed repeated complaints about brutality and abuse. Human Rights Watch documented allegations of beatings, dog attacks, and pain compliance techniques, officers using restraints and pepper spray to subdue already locked prisoners. In 2011, a report revealed that over 60% of Red Onion's population was African American, even though Virginia's overall black population was around 20%. Many inmates described being written up for minor infractions and sent to segregation indefinitely. One man, Kevin Rashid Johnson, managed to smuggle out drawings and essays that described life inside the cell. His artwork, depicting chained men in coffin-sized rooms, made headlines in Europe before it did in America. "They built Red Onion for control," he wrote, "but what they created is suffering dressed in bureaucracy." At USP Thomson, the pattern continued. The Prison's Special Management Unit, SMU, became notorious for high suicide rates and use of force incidents. The Department of Justice's own Inspector General found that between 2012 and 2020, dozens of inmates were held in double-celled isolation, 2 men locked together in spaces designed for one. Tensions boiled over. Stabbings and assaults surged. Guards called it the pressure cooker. Even at the federal level, the Bureau of Prisons began to admit the obvious. In a 2016 internal review, they concluded that prolonged isolation had significant negative psychological effects, and that many inmates inside ADX didn't meet the original most dangerous criteria anymore. Some were there simply because they'd mouthed off to staff or refused orders. What began as a targeted system for violent extremists had quietly expanded into a mass mechanism of control. But there's a deeper layer most people never see, the one involving the guards themselves. Working in Supermax facilities comes with its own psychological cost. Former officers from ADX and Pelican Bay reported suffering from PTSD, depression, and burnout. Some described nightmares of locking doors over and over again, or hearing phantom screams long after their shift ended. One former correctional officer, speaking anonymously, said, "You start to forget they're human. And that's how you survive the job." For both sides of the steel door, isolation becomes contagious. Even reformers faced resistance. When President Obama in 2016 banned solitary confinement for juveniles in federal prisons, many states ignored the guidance. By 2022, watchdogs like the ACLU and Solitary Watch reported that tens of thousands of adults were still being held in conditions virtually identical to the old Supermax model, despite new names like administrative segregation or restrictive housing. The labels changed. The suffering didn't. Inside the box, time stretches and identity dissolves. Some men pace endlessly, 7 steps forward, 7 back, over and over. Others refuse food for days in protest. A few write poetry on toilet paper or letters to journalists they'll never meet. For them, resistance isn't about escape, it's about staying alive long enough to be remembered. The system's defenders say it's necessary, that removing dangerous inmates protects the rest of the population. But the evidence tells a darker story. When the mind breaks, the violence doesn't disappear, it mutates. Inmates released from solitary are more likely to reoffend, more likely to harm themselves, and less likely to reintegrate. America built its Supermax network to contain danger, but in doing so, it may have created a deeper, quieter form of chaos, one that lives in the shadows of every locked door. And yet, this is only half the story. Because behind every reform and lawsuit lies something far older, a philosophy of punishment that's been shaping American prisons for centuries. Long before the concrete walls of ADX Florence sealed shut, America's prison philosophy was already shifting toward one idea, that isolation purifies the soul. To understand the Supermax era, we have to go back nearly 2 centuries, to the birth of solitary confinement itself. In the early 1800s, when the Eastern State Penitentiary opened in Philadelphia, reformers called it the House of Repentance. Built by the Quakers, it was designed around one radical principle: complete silence. Each prisoner lived alone, ate alone, and worked alone, with hoods placed over their heads whenever they left their cells. The belief was simple, that solitude and reflection would lead to spiritual rebirth. But reality told another story. Within just a few years, inspectors noticed men losing their minds. Some wept uncontrollably. Others tore at their clothes or begged to be executed. Charles Dickens visited the prison in 1842 and later wrote, "I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body." Still, the idea stuck. From Eastern State to Sing Sing and later Alcatraz, the pattern repeated: isolation as order, silence as safety. Each new prison promised reform. Each one ended in despair. By the 1930s, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary stood as America's fortress of fear, a prototype for what would come decades later. Located on a rocky island in San Francisco Bay, it housed some of the nation's most infamous criminals: Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz. But behind the legend was a brutal system. Guards enforced silence rules so strict that inmates were punished for whispering during meals. The isolation units, known as D Block and the Hole, were underground cells with no light, no bedding, and no contact. Prisoners described hearing their own heartbeat echo through the walls. One former guard recalled, "You didn't need chains to control them. The silence did that." When Alcatraz closed in 1963, it wasn't because America had abandoned the idea of isolation. It was because it had learned how to perfect it. The next generation of prisons would take the same philosophy and replace crude violence with sterile precision. No beatings, no blood, just architecture designed to do the breaking for you. By the late 20th century, that evolution had a name, the Supermax. It wasn't just a building. It was a system, a national experiment in psychological control. At ADX Florence, every aspect of the inmate's life was reduced to automation. Lights turned on and off at the same times. Meals arrived through mechanical slots. Showers were controlled by timers. Human contact was eliminated almost entirely. Even the design of the prison was mathematical. Hallways calculated to eliminate blind spots, corners rounded to reduce ambushes, and doors wired to lock automatically during emergencies. The architects of ADX were proud of their creation. They called it a prison that runs itself. But psychologists saw something darker, a machine built to erase identity. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist who studied inmates in solitary, described the effects as a predictable psychiatric syndrome. He found that even healthy individuals, when placed in isolation, began showing signs of hallucination, paranoia, hypersensitivity to noise, and extreme anxiety within weeks. The brain, he wrote, is not built for emptiness. At Pelican Bay, similar studies confirmed his findings. A 2012 report by the Center for Constitutional Rights found that nearly half of all prisoners in the SHU had symptoms of mental illness, many of whom had no diagnosis before their confinement. The report concluded that isolation was not just punishment, it was transformation. Men entered as inmates. They left as something else. Still, public opinion rarely wavered. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the tough on crime movement dominated political campaigns. Politicians promised safety through severity. Governors boasted about building the most secure prisons. And the media, often fed exclusive footage of violent riots or gang warfare, helped sell the illusion that supermaxes were necessary, that without them, chaos would spill into the streets. But inside, a quiet rebellion was brewing. In 2011, thousands of inmates across California, many from Pelican Bay, Corcoran, and Tehachapi, began a historic hunger strike. Their demand was simple: end indefinite solitary confinement. Some of these men had been locked away for 20 to 30 years, often based on gang validation, a system that punished inmates not for violent acts, but for suspected associations or tattoos. The strike grew rapidly. Within weeks, over 6,600 prisoners joined statewide. Families, activists, and civil rights groups rallied in support. The ACLU and Human Rights Watch began to document cases where men had died by suicide inside their cells, their only crime being defiance. Among them was Armando Morales, a 44-year-old inmate found dead in his SHU cell at Pelican Bay. Reports indicated he'd been in isolation for nearly a decade. His death became a rallying point, proof that the system was collapsing under its own cruelty. By 2015, after years of lawsuits and protests, the Ashker versus Governor of California settlement forced the state to release hundreds from long-term solitary confinement. It was one of the largest reforms in U.S. prison history. Yet even then, the victory was bittersweet. Many of those released were simply moved to new forms of restricted housing, a different name for the same box. As reforms spread, the public began to ask new questions. If isolation doesn't stop violence, what does? If total control breaks the mind, who pays the price when those minds return to society? Researchers from Yale and Harvard later studied inmates released from solitary confinement and found a chilling statistic. Those who spent extended periods in isolation were 20 times more likely to die by suicide within the first year of release. The system designed for safety was silently manufacturing tragedy. And yet, despite decades of evidence, supermaxes still stand. ADX Florence remains fully operational, housing over 300 inmates, many under near-permanent lockdown. Red Onion continues its segregation units. USP Thomson, before partial closures, maintains some of the harshest federal restrictions in the country. Each cell a repetition of the same experiment, testing how much silence the human mind can survive. But maybe the most haunting part isn't the cruelty. It's how normal it has become. When society accepts that certain people deserve to disappear, to be buried alive in concrete, it begins to redefine justice itself. The Supermax was never just a building. It was a mirror, reflecting what a nation fears and what it's willing to do in the name of control. For decades, what happened inside America's Supermax prisons stayed hidden behind concrete, bureaucracy, and silence. The reports that did reach the public were often redacted, softened, or dismissed as isolated incidents. But cracks began to appear, not in the walls but in the people who worked behind them. In 2012, Robert Hood, a former warden of ADX Florence, gave an interview that sent shockwaves through the correctional world. Hood had overseen the Supermax during the early 2000s, managing some of the most dangerous men in America. Yet when asked about his time there, he didn't boast about safety or control. Instead, he said something few expected. "It's not built for humanity. I call it a clean version of hell." That statement, coming from a career prison official, was more than a critique, it was a confession. Hood described a world where even guards became desensitized, where the sound of metal doors replaced conversation, and where he could walk an entire shift without hearing a single voice. "We were trained to see silence as success," he said. "But silence can hide suffering." Other whistleblowers followed. Alan Breed, a corrections veteran who later joined the U.S. Department of Justice, publicly condemned long-term isolation as a slow death. He revealed how administrators often kept inmates in Supermaxes for security convenience, not actual danger, because paperwork, staffing, and budgets all favored segregation. "The system rewards isolation," he warned, "not rehabilitation." At Pelican Bay, retired officer Richard Kirkland described watching inmates lose themselves. He recalled seeing men who once ran prison gangs become hollow-eyed and withdrawn. "They just stared at the wall," he said. "After a few years they weren't dangerous anymore, just broken." Kirkland admitted that many officers began to question their role. Some tried to smuggle in books or write small notes of encouragement. Others transferred to different facilities to escape the moral weight. But in Supermax culture, empathy was seen as weakness. One officer who spoke anonymously said, "You can't show emotion in there. The building eats it." The voices of those inside were harder to hear, but when they did emerge, they changed the conversation forever. In 2014, investigative journalist Shane Bauer went undercover as a prison guard at Wynn Correctional Center in Louisiana. His exposé for Mother Jones revealed the same psychological decay spreading across the private and state systems. Guards were paid $9 an hour, often working double shifts, surrounded by human misery. Bauer later reflected. A former inmate once described the system perfectly. "It's like Wall Street but with shanks. Everyone's got a hustle and everyone's trying not to get stabbed over it. And the hustles are endless." Some inmates sell food they've saved from the kitchen, cook-ups. They call them noodles, tuna, chips, and hot sauce mixed together and resold to hungry cellmates. Others offer services, writing letters, drawing tattoos, or running gambling rings on sports games using makeshift dice. The jail has its own black market, its own supply chain, its own invisible stock exchange. Even information becomes currency. Knowing when a search is coming, who's getting transferred, or which CO can be bribed, all of it has price tags. Inmates who can't pay in goods or favors sometimes offer intelligence instead. In Cook County Jail, snitching isn't always about survival. Sometimes it's just another business deal. But the most lucrative hustle of all? Drugs. Despite the heavy surveillance, narcotics flow through the jail constantly. Small packets of Suboxone, heroin, or synthetic marijuana, known as K2, are slipped in through staff, drones, or visitors. Once inside, they're split, diluted, and resold for massive profit. The gangs oversee distribution, keeping violence in check to protect business. When someone messes up the flow, the punishment is swift and bloody. For those not involved in gangs, the economy still matters. It's how they survive. A man with commissary can make friends. A man without it, he's a ghost. Hungry, vulnerable, forgotten. In a place where the system offers little, hustling isn't greed, it's survival. But this underground economy doesn't just shape daily life, it fuels the violence. Every debt unpaid, every trade gone wrong, every double cross becomes a spark. Fights break out not over grudges but over business disputes. And in Cook County, disputes are rarely settled with words. To the public, it's just another jail. To those inside, it's a city within a city with its own rules, markets, taxes, and bloodlines. Guards enforce one law, the inmates enforce another. Between them lies the real Cook County, a place where power, profit, and pain are traded in equal measure. No reform can touch it. No warden can fully stop it. Because for decades, this underground economy hasn't just survived, it's thrived. And in the end, it's what keeps Cook County Jail alive. In Cook County Jail, violence isn't random, it's ritual. It's the language that maintains respect, enforces order, and decides who lives to see another day. Every punch, every stab, every silent nod carries meaning. Outsiders might call it chaos, but inside there's always a reason for the blood that hits the concrete. Every tier, every day, tension hums beneath the surface. Gangs divide the blocks: gangster disciples, vice lords, black disciples, Latin kings, and four-corner hustlers. Each group has its rules, its symbols, its sworn loyalties. The lines are invisible, but everyone knows where they lie. Cross them and you're done. The violence starts young. Some of these men were born into gangs. Their fathers wore the same colors. Their brothers taught them the same codes. For them, the jail isn't new territory, it's home turf with walls. When rival members meet inside, old grudges reignite like dry powder. And in a place this crowded, there's nowhere to run. Fights can spark from almost nothing: a stolen snack, a disrespectful stare, a whispered insult. But behind those small sparks are deep wars, decades-long feuds carried over from Chicago's neighborhoods. Inside the walls, they settle what the streets couldn't. Surveillance videos have shown what that looks like: flashes of movement, shouts, then chaos. Dozens of inmates rushing from their bunks, fists flying, makeshift weapons glinting under fluorescent light. Guards yell for backup, but by the time they arrive, the floor's already slick with blood and the fighters are panting, eyes still locked in hatred. Sometimes the violence comes with no warning at all. A man might be laughing with his tear one moment, then collapse the next, stabbed from behind with a sharpened toothbrush. The weapon disappears before officers can find it. The silence afterward is eerie. Everyone knows what happened, but no one speaks. The no-snitch rule isn't a suggestion here, it's survival. Gang leaders often control the rhythm of this violence. When business is good, contraband moving, commissary flowing, they keep the peace. But when disrespect occurs or an order is ignored, blood becomes the message. It's how they maintain control without ever raising their voices. "You don't argue in Cook County," one former inmate said. "You prove your point." The guards too are caught in the middle. Some become targets, others reluctant allies. They see the aftermath: the broken noses, the stitched wounds, the haunted eyes. Some have been attacked, ambushed during searches or meals. And yet, many officers admit something few outsiders understand. Sometimes they rely on the gangs to keep order. "If the shot callers say chill, it stays calm," one CO confessed. "If they say riot, we're done." In 2022, a leaked video from Division 9 made headlines. A group of inmates brutally beating another in full view of a security camera. The guards didn't intervene right away, not out of neglect, but because rushing in could spark an even bigger riot. That's the constant calculation inside Cook County: when to act and when to survive. Each act of violence leaves scars that never fade. Some inmates leave with missing teeth or stitched-up faces. Others leave in body bags. But most carry invisible wounds, trauma, paranoia, and the memory of the sound steel makes when it hits flesh. In Cook County Jail, violence isn't a moment. It's a cycle. It feeds itself, generation after generation. Young men come in angry, broken, and lost, and they leave harder, colder, more dangerous. And so the legend of Cook County grows. One fight, one riot, one death at a time. Because behind those walls, peace isn't the absence of violence, it's just the time between the next one. Cook County Jail stands like a mirror, reflecting the cracks in America's justice system. Overcrowded, underfunded, and overrun by the same gangs that rule the streets, it has become a monument to survival, not rehabilitation. Every man inside learns the same lesson: the system doesn't protect you, it tests you. It tests your patience, your loyalty, your sanity. And if you fail, it swallows you whole. Some inmates call it the county, others hell with a schedule. But one thing they all agree on: no one leaves the same. For the officers, it's a battlefield in uniform. For the inmates, it's a fight to stay human in a place designed to strip you of that. And for the rest of Chicago, it's a reminder of what happens when poverty, violence, and neglect collide inside four walls. So the next time you hear about Cook County Jail, remember this: behind the numbers, the scandals, and the news clips, there's a living, breathing world ruled by fear, loyalty, and survival. A world where gangs write the rules. Where silence means safety. And where justice is just another word that doesn't reach the tier. If you want more real stories like this, true accounts from inside America's most dangerous prisons, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because next time, we're going deeper inside the walls.